Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hannah Zaberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. Thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Samsung Galaxy 19, Amazon Fire, Roku TV, and Apple TV. Many of the world's biggest fashion brands and retailers are complicit in the forced labor and human rights violations being perpetrated on millions of Uyghurs in East Turkestan. This is the northwestern part of China that we often talk about on this show. A coalition of more than 180 human rights and workers' rights, as well as 72 Uyghur rights organizations has joined this coalition. There's mounting outrage over the atrocities being committed against the Uyghur population in the region, including torture, forced separation, and compulsory sterilization of Uyghur women. Despite these excuses, the coalition of human rights groups says many of the world's leading clothing brands continue to source cotton and yarn produced through a vast state-sponsored system of forced labor involving up to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim people in prison camps, factories, and farms in that region, which is called Xinjiang, but we like to refer it to East Turkestan as the people of that region like to refer it to. It says that the coalition says that the forced labor system across the region is the largest impairment of an ethnic and religious minority since the Second World War. Joining us today are Ilfidar Max Gelber from the Max Gelber from the Uyghur American Association, and Penelope Christis from the Workers' Right Coalition. Both of these organizations take leading part in this coalition. And a disclaimer, Justice for All is also a part of this coalition. Thank you so much for joining us. Ilfidar is the secretary of the Uyghur American Association. Mark Gelber is the director of special projects at the Campaign for Uyghurs, as well as the program director for the Uyghur American Association. Max has worked and studied throughout China and Central Asia. So we're really glad to have these experts here to tell us more about the coalition, how it's going to work, and what will take place. Thank you so much, all of you. So let's start from the beginning. I wanted to perhaps do a round of introductions. I know we went over a little bit of your backgrounds, but just to let the audience know a little bit more about the work that each of your organizations do and the work that what brought you into this field. Max, if you'd like to start first.
Sure, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. My name is Max Gelber, and I'm the program director for the Uyghur American Association, based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. I've been the program director since March of this year, and my primary role is building on our advocacy, putting pressure on U.S. government, members of Congress, and others to apply pressure to China to end the genocide in East Turkestan. I came to the Uyghur cause in a labyrinthine way. I studied in China, I studied Mandarin Chinese, and I quickly learned about these issues in East Turkestan in the far northwest part of China. And I was immediately moved by the plight of the Uyghur people. So I encourage everybody, no matter what kind of expertise you have, to get involved in saving lives in East Turkestan. It's of critical importance. It's the #1 human rights crisis of our time that all of us should pay attention to. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Elfidar?
Assalam. My name is Elfidar. I'm Uyghur American. I've been living in the U.S. since 2000. since I came to this country. I've been working voluntarily for UAA for small projects and events. Since last year, I started to work as secretary of UAA. Um, what we really do here is try to promote and preserve Uyghur culture. Also train and educate our future leaders, I should say, the young Uyghur Americans. Um, I'm glad to be here and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Penelope.
Thank you, Hannah, for having us. My name is Penelope Kiritsis. I'm Assistant Research Director at the Worker Rights Consortium. The Worker Rights Consortium is an independent labor rights monitoring organization. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we operate around the world and we focus on the garment sector. So we began doing work on Uyghur forced labor when it became clear that garments was a sector that was especially tainted by forced labor in the Uyghur region. Thank you for having me.
So one of the most horrific elements of the detainment camps is the forced labor camps that provide inventory for different mainstream fashion companies. Nike, H&M, Zara. These are brands that any one of us might find in our own closets. These camps tear Uyghurs apart from their own families. They exploit them to the fullest extent and damage the health of Uyghur people, all while never paying them enough money to live on. So, how did these forced labor camps come to develop, and how long have they been in existence? And how has the Chinese government tried to hide these camps?
Yeah, I can start. Really, a lot of the media attention surrounding forced labor and the companies complicit and benefiting from Uyghur forced labor in East Turkestan, the Uyghur region, came out of a March report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that claimed between 2017 and 2019, 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang, out of East Turkestan, to work in factories throughout China. And though Uyghur groups have been talking about these kind of actions by the Chinese Communist Party to transfer Uyghur laborers into forced labor camps, this was really the bombshell report that revealed all of this to the world. And since then, a lot of organizations and citizens have mobilized to kind of hold these companies accountable. The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, is no stranger to repression of the Uyghurs. The Uyghur concentration camp issue has been around for quite a while and has caught attention from heads of state. Is across media and headlines around the world. It's been heavily reported on. But this is no stranger to Uyghurs. Uyghurs have known this for quite a long time, and Elfidar can talk a little bit about this. There have been tensions in the region between the state and the Uyghur people and other indigenous people of East Turkestan for decades. And the crackdowns from the Chinese Communist Party, unrelenting crackdowns, have been in existence for decades. So this is not a new issue. And part of the reason why it hasn't cultivated a lot of attention until as of late is because no independent auditors are allowed in China to investigate such issues. Special rapporteurs and agencies, organizations are not allowed in. Reporters are heavily restricted when they go to the region and want to talk to Uyghur people. And I'll stop there and let Alfidar kind of dovetail with that discussion.
In addition to what Max said, we've known this has been going on for quite a while, for many, many years. But since the control in China was so strong, it was very hard to get those information out because they monitor internet, they monitor your phone, they monitor everything. So people there can't speak up. They're afraid if they speak up, they will be in jail or prison or back to camps. So it was very hard to get that what's going on, those information out from China. we were, as an Uyghur, hearing stories here and there, and we knew what has been going on, but it was very hard to prove. We didn't have enough evidence, I would say. It was scattered. I guess the world was waiting for a neutral Western researchers to prove it. And recently, Adrian Zen's report showed that what has been going on. And then it took the attention of the world and media.
Yes, Penelope, this is something that I've reported on this. I used to be a journalist. I've reported on this for over 10 years. And this is a point of contention that I have, that Uyghur voices are not heard. People, for example, Erkin Siddiq has been reporting on this for years in Uyghur language. He writes about this, he emails people about this. He's one of my mentors. And before that, I have interviewed Uyghurs who have escaped from that area. But this did not get the attention until a Western light was shined on this. What can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? That Uyghur voices are heard, or people who are most impacted, their voices are heard. Like, look at what Erkin says. Even today, he just broke news of that he got information from the region that Uyghur youth are being transported and enslaved in Han provinces. They make less than $100 a month. They work more than 12 plus hours a day. They get beat physically and abused if they don't finish their daily workload. And they can't go outside the factory. They live with very low quality diet and poor health. These are slaves. And they're threatened with 20 years plus in jail if they talk to a foreign reporter or receive a call from abroad.
Thank you for the question. I would also say that the Chinese government is trying very hard to conceal what is happening in the Uyghur region, and that is also part of the issue. They are presenting what is happening as poverty alleviation efforts, but we know that's not true. As you have pointed out, Uyghurs that have left the camps have testified to this firsthand. Their family members who have a lot to lose have risked their lives and their safety to bring this message out to the public. And quite honestly, I am baffled that it's taken so long for this to become a mainstream issue. To your point, Hannah, about the pervasive surveillance, that is also why, as a coalition, we are telling brands and retailers that they need to exit the region. It is because, given the pervasive surveillance and the near certainty that there is forced labor, not just in the camps, but also in the farms, also in satellite factories, you name it, given the pervasive risk of forced labor that taints the whole Uyghur region and also other parts of China, given what Max has said about forced labor transfers, it is simply not possible for an independent auditor to interview a worker and get candid testimony. That is a prerequisite for any labor rights monitoring. And that is simply not possible given the climate of fear and repression in the region.
That's a very important point that you made. Could you explain to the audience, what does it, as a labor rights consortium, when you all do your audits, what do those audits look like?
So the Worker Rights Consortium, our methodology is centered on workers, on worker testimony. And when we do factory investigations in other parts of the world, our primary data comes from interviews with workers that are almost always conducted off-site, so not in the factory. Normally near workers' homes, where workers hang out, where their community organizations are. This is because there is general consensus among labor rights auditors and monitors that in order to get candid information and credible information, you need to be able to interview a worker without them being afraid of retaliation, either by, you can't, for example, be interviewing a worker and the factory manager is just walking right behind them. You won't get candid testimony. So this is the golden standard, is to be able to interview workers in a place where they feel safe and where they will tell you the truth about what is happening to them. And for all the reasons that you have outlined and that Max and Elfidar have outlined, that is simply not possible in the Uyghur region.
Elfidar, could you talk to that? Why is that not possible for Uyghurs?
As Penelope mentioned it, not only for Uyghurs in our homeland, even for the Uyghurs in abroad, US, they're not still comfortable. There is still fear of retaliation. So basically on the US soil, if I speak up, they might take my family members into the concentration camps. So that's how well China tried to control, so the word is not out on the media. That's one of the way, I would say, why it's so difficult. The surveillance inside, all that control and punishment, and then abroad, the relatives or other Uyghurs, friends and families, they can't speak up. They have to keep quiet because they're afraid of their family members' condition, basically.
And Max, we worked on the Uyghur Human Rights Project that brings some sort of safety to Uyghur Americans so they can speak up and then they won't be targeted by the FBI, targeted by the Chinese government, so the FBI can protect them over here. Can you talk share a little bit about that with our audience?
Like Elfidar had mentioned, the reach of the Chinese Communist Party extends far beyond their borders. And since I joined the Uyghur American Association in March of this year, I have not met one Uyghur family who doesn't have multiple family members who are either locked up in jail, without trial, no less. I mean, without any degree of representation, closed off courtrooms, thin evidence or non-existent evidence for prosecution, right? Or who don't have family members in the concentration camps or forced labor camps. The Chinese Communist Party is ingenious when it comes to hijacking families to make sure that those in the Uyghurs like Elfidar in the diaspora communities throughout Europe, United States, Turkey, Australia, and other places, to silence them, to not speak up about the atrocities going on in East Turkestan. Unfortunately, I can't speak so much to what the FBI is doing to protect Uyghurs here, but I will say that it's very difficult to ensure folks' safety here in the United States. I should rephrase that. It's very difficult to ensure Uyghur safety, the Uyghur family members' safety in East Turkestan. So that's something that's very difficult for the United States to do. We've seen hacking, we've seen threatening and harassing messages from CCP agents over such platforms as WeChat, which is the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp. And we've heard firsthand from Uyghurs who have received phone calls from the Chinese Communist Party agents saying, well, if you continue to speak out on Twitter or Facebook, you will never speak to your mother, father, sister, brother, cousin again. I think that strong government policy on the US side is absolutely necessary to protect Uyghur Americans and Uyghurs in the diaspora. At the same time, I think it's incumbent upon the Trump administration and the US government to apply stricter and more sanctions against those perpetrators in East Turkestan.
Definitely. Now, I can relate to everything that you have said. I say this often on the show. I have yet to meet a Uyghur who has not been affected by this. Our own colleague, Aydin, has 90 family members and neighbors and friends, but 90 close family members who are missing, and they don't, so we hear these stories and anywhere we go. So this idea that this is all Western propaganda and people shouldn't be paying attention because this is an American-China new Cold War. This is something that we constantly have to dismantle. I'd love to hear from the three of you how you address this when you are confronted by when people call this propaganda.
I just spoke, so I'll defer to somebody else to speak first. I have quite a few thoughts on this.
I can go ahead and I'll let Elfidar and Max add to what I'm going to say. For us at the WRC and for the coalition itself, this is not an issue of geopolitics. This is an issue of basic human rights and protecting the right of people from the Uyghur region to not be targeted by genocide and crimes against humanity. That is our stance. And what our position is that in addition to governments needing to take robust action to protect the lives of these people, it is also necessary for corporations around the world to stop benefiting and propping up this system of repression. And I'll let my colleagues Max and Elfidar weigh in as well. Thank you.
I agree with what she said. This is not the Muslim issues, or it's not one group of ethnical people issue. This is humanitarian issue that everyone needs to speak up. Otherwise, this might come to them. This might come to their country. Uyghurs, they're not only, we cannot even communicate our family members in the US. I don't know how many of my relatives are in the concentration camp, forced labor camps, because I cannot communicate. They don't answer my calls. So not only political sensitive issues, even like regular news, we don't hear it on time. If, for example, my friend's father passed away, they heard after a month. So that's basic, very basic human rights, like basic things that we cannot have. Like Uyghurs are there fighting for existence. I think the whole world should take this very serious. What have been going on is very unbelievable. We've been speaking about this for a while. It's unacceptable. It is definitely a genocide. The forced abortion, the sterilization, and kids being sent to orphanages, being apart from their families, not being able to speak your own language, not being able to preserve your own culture. Those are just unacceptable.
So one thing that Elfidar said just now really stood out. And it has a lot to do with why some will say, well, this is just Western propaganda. She said the term unbelievable. And these human rights violations are unprecedented and at such a gross, egregious level that it's easier for people to chalk it up to propaganda. Because if they recognize and if they admit, well, this is happening, right? I'm looking at the evidence right here, and this genocide is happening. It's ongoing as we speak. 1.8 million people in concentration camps in East Turkestan. Then it's incumbent on us to act, and that's a heavy responsibility. So I think that's part of the reason why people say it must be propaganda, simply because it's at such a scale and such a breadth that it's hard to wrap one's mind around. I mean, it's the largest, most significant human rights crisis since World War II, since the Holocaust. I'd like to pivot back a little bit to the coalition to end forced labor in the Uyghur region. As Penelope said, as a conduit for people to hold, for everyday people to hold companies accountable for being complicit in Uyghur forced labor. Stop buying those products. More than 80% of China's cotton is grown in the Uyghur region, and that encompasses 20% or almost 20% of global cotton production. There's not one thing you're wearing that is free from Uyghur forced labor by the very virtue of cotton production in East Turkestan. The other thing I'd like to mention is that due diligence is impossible in the region. So in no way is forced labor a problem just for the Uyghur region, just for East Turkestan or just China. Forced labor happens all over the world. The difference is wonderful organizations like the Workers' Rights Consortium and others have no real way to I guess, vet and audit these companies and brands. There's only one solution, and this is not just me talking, right? This is 200 organizations endorsing, and 72 Uyghur organizations, labor and human rights organizations, civil society organizations from all around the world, hundreds of them, saying there's only one solution, that the companies need to leave East Turkestan, and they need to do it as soon as possible.
This is so powerful, and we're going to be showing the coalition website so you can take a look at the variety of organizations that have supported this call, and the actual asks. And we'll talk about the asks in just a minute. I want to ask you, Penelope and Max, and of course Elfidar, how many companies do we believe are using this labor from these camps, number one? And how does the supply chain between forced labor and the companies utilizing it develop over time? This is something very important that people are also not understanding, because they don't see that link. Like, how does my Polo Ralph Lauren shirt, what does that have to do with Muslim slaves? Or my shoes, what does that have to do with Muslim slaves? This is an American company. I buy it from TJ Maxx. What are you talking about?
I'm happy to take this one first. So as Max has said, 20% of the world's cotton comes from the Uyghur region. This translates to a jarring statistic. 1 in 5 cotton garments in the global market are potentially tainted by Uyghur forced labor. Now that's huge. What we're saying as a coalition is it's not a case of bad apples. There are some brands who are involved and some who aren't. The entire supply chain, the entire global garment supply chain is tainted by forced labor from the Uyghur region. Mm-hmm. And so that's one point. And the second point about how these supply chain dynamics operate, Max alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there are various levels of complicity. There's the sourcing aspect, which is sourcing cotton or cotton-based goods from the region. There's the labor transfers, which Max and Elfidar also talked about. It's a situation where there are many, many, many people from the Uyghur region that are forcibly transferred to other parts of China and made to work in forced labor conditions and are politically indoctrinated in those factories. And the third one, which is a little bit more complex, is there are major textile firms from China and one from Hong Kong that have received government subsidies to either expand their operations or set up operations in the Uyghur region. These subsidies have also been given to these companies so that they can recruit and re-educate workers in factories, sometimes factories that are in the same compound as an internment camp. So the complicity there is very evident. And these companies have extensive ties to brands and retailers around the world. So there are various levels through which global apparel brands are complicit in this unprecedented forced labor and human rights crisis in the Uyghur region.
Max, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, can you repeat the question one more time? I'm so sorry.
That's fine. So I wanted to know, how did this supply link between forced labor and the several companies that are being held responsible by the coalition, how did it develop over time?
Penelope hit the answer spot on, but I want to draw the audience's attention to the 13-ton shipment of beauty products, including weave, that was seized on July 2nd from Customs and Border Protection at the Port of New York. This shipment originated from East Turkestan and was flagged because of potential forced labor and imprisonment abuses. These products were worth over $800,000. 13 tons. How many products is 13 tons? I mean, what does a weave weigh, right? One set of weave hair weigh, and to to be 13 tons of products seized, and that's just one shipment, right? It's just the scale is unbelievable. So I would, I really want to emphasize how complex supply chains are around the world, and they're getting even more complex all the time. I mean, if you think about, in your example, you talked about buying a shirt at TJ Maxx, and it has a brand. Well, that brand could just be in name. Somebody's manufacturing the product, the raw materials, in this case, cotton, and other compounds, polyester. I mean, there could be 15 different composite materials and raw materials that are used, coming from 5 different facilities from 3 different countries, and we get one label. And what does it say? It could say made in the USA, but all the component parts for that, everything down to the very cotton comes from elsewhere. So these things are exceedingly difficult to track and extremely complicated. And with complexity, it makes Penelope and others' jobs much more difficult, because to track and audit the supply chain takes a lot of time and diligence.
Now this is let's get to now the call to action. What is the coalition asking for, and what will be the methodology? Please explain this.
Do you want me to take this one? Great. So we are asking every apparel brand and retailer to exit the Uyghur region at every level of the supply chain, from cotton all the way to ready-made garments, within 12 months. In addition to that, we are asking global brands and retailers to cease their relationships with these companies that I discussed that have benefited materially from the forced labor of the Uyghur people. And in addition to that, we are also asking companies to make sure that when they are sourcing from factories that are outside of the Uyghur region, to make sure that that factory is not forcibly employing Uyghur people who have been forcibly transferred there from their homeland. That's a distilled version of the asks. And to ensure that companies are doing this, we are asking for them to, one, commit to this in a public fashion. We are going to, as a coalition, we are going to maintain a public list of who has signed on and who hasn't. In addition to that, we are asking for an implementation plan so that we can monitor progress as a coalition. And we are asking for disclosure information. We are asking for these brands and retailers to prove to us that they are not using forced labor by giving us a list of their suppliers.
Okay. And so they have 365 days to do this, from what I understand. And now there is a PDF on the website. What is that PDF? Who is that PDF targeted to? Who signs on to it?
It's targeted at the brands. So we want apparel brands and retailers to formally sign on to our call to action. Okay.
So one of the things that when we were sharing this about, so a lot of people want to do personal action, right? Lay people who are possible. So what can lay people do? They've seen this, they've seen the coalition, they've seen the amount of organizations that have signed on. Now they want to do something about this. What are some of the things that they can do?
I can take, go ahead, Alfadan.
No, go ahead, you talk about that, and I would like to talk from what Uyghurs would like to do part. So you talk about the coalition, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I'll let Penelope fill us in as well. I would say that folks should share the website, share social media coming out of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, share materials, and also try to get other like-minded organizations to endorse the call to action. Over 200 organizations have already endorsed. We're always looking for more. Read up on the issues. Contact your member of Congress if you're in the United States, and ask him or her to support, by way of co-sponsorship, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There are companion bills in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. It's incredibly simple to call your member of Congress who represents you and tell them, look, we cannot stand by as millions of people continue to live under the iron fist of the Chinese Communist Party, who are restricted in their movement, who cannot speak openly, who cannot speak to their family members, who are locked up in concentration camps, and who are toiling away at labor without pay, without remuneration. So I would tell them to put pressure on the US government through Congress to support the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that's what we're working on at Uyghur American Association and other partner organizations as well.
Fadar, would you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Penelope and Max clearly emphasizes the main asks of the coalition. As an Uyghur American, I would like to add what would us, like Uyghurs, would like addition to all those main asks. We would like Muslim world to come together and speak up. We would like them to raise the awareness and educate each other, and then bring up this issue to the world, because China's economy gets its stability, its legitimacy from its economic growth. Humanitarian asks or moral arguments is not going to work for Chinese government. It's not going to work for them. What works is impact them economically. So if Muslim countries get together and raise the awareness and bring these issues up to China, they can stop, because Muslim countries on the road of One Belt, One Road initiatives, and it affects China's economic plans. If they come together and say no or stop to China, it will impact them. All of us together can say, stop the forced labor, stop the concentration camp, stop this genocide, stop the assimilation, whatever is going on in our homeland. That will be our ask, as well as all others that are mentioned.
Definitely. As we look at, this message that we're seeing on the screen needs to be spread throughout the world, that we need to end this enslaved labor. It cannot just be coming from the diaspora. It just cannot be coming from those of us who live in Western countries, Muslim countries. So one of the things that we are pushing for, especially this as Eid is coming up, that we want people to boycott these companies. If you buy from them, write to them, write to Gap and Zara and Fila and Adidas. This is the time when we're often buying, clothes for our kids. We're buying, Eid is a special celebratory time. And we often ask we give gifts to our families. And a lot of times these gifts are from these fashion brands who are using our own brothers and sisters in Islam as slaves. This is something that we really need to think about. Really, like, we talk about this a lot. We've been pushing for this. If you write to these companies and send them the PDF that's on the end Uyghur Human Rights, Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition, send them the PDF and say, sign on. If you want my business, sign on to this and make the pledge to get out of the supply chain. One of the other things is that if we could, Max touched on this, is and then calling your Congress people, especially those of us who are here. And in Canada, there is a petition out. If enough signatures are gathered for that petition, then the MPs will be forced to listen to the Uyghur cause over there. So that is something. We'll share the link to the petition in comments. But here in the United States, there is a bill in Congress that a lot of us are pushing for, which is HR 6210. And so tell us a little bit more about HR 6210, Max, if you'd like to. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Oh, we can't hear you.
You're muted.
This is it's the Forced Labor Prevention Act. And while we get Max to come on, Elfidar, would you like to?
I'm back.
Oh, you're back.
I'm so sorry. New platform. I didn't know how to unmute myself. There are all these things flashing and moving on the screen. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, HR 6210, was introduced in March by Jim McGovern, Representative Jim McGovern. And it's a really critical piece of legislation. It goes beyond stopping imports from forced labor. It says we're going to designate this area, the Uyghur region, as a forced labor zone. The rebuttable presumption that anything coming out of the Uyghur region is complicit or made with forced labor. And therefore, the US, we can't have those goods in this country. We can't import them. So that rebuttable presumption is a key point here, because it puts the burden of proof on the individual companies to prove that they have a clean supply chain, clean from forced labor, which, as Penelope, Elfidar, myself, and most members of the coalition, or if not all members of the coalition, would say it's totally impossible to prove that for most of these countries that your products aren't tainted by forced labor. So that rebuttable presumption is important. It's like North Korea. Products coming from North Korea can't be imported to the United States. I think that's a key point for those viewers to understand. So we need this legislation, and we need it now. The best thing you can do is get your members of Congress to co-sponsor the legislation and put pressure on committee members to push this bill forward.
We have a question by one of the show's viewers. NS is asking, which international court has jurisdiction to protect the endangered rights and freedoms of these oppressed people? Has anyone initiated legal proceedings? And I know there's a case in ICC.
The International Criminal Court, yeah. So, Penelope, do you have an answer to this? Elfidar, do you have an answer to this? I'm inclined to say that there's a UN agency. I mean, there are just a number. There's a cornucopia of laws that are supposed to protect indigenous people all over the world, but I can't single one out.
I think the International Criminal Court complaint was to specifically designate what is happening in the region as a genocide, which is extremely important. I agree with Max that there are many laws and many legal instruments that are designed to protect to protect the Uyghur people, and these need to be used at their full disposal. I would also like to add that regardless of whichever diplomatic routes are pursued, this doesn't change the fact that brands and retailers are responsible to ensure that there's no forced labor in their supply chains. So I just wanted to disentangle those two things.
It's very important to know that.
And to dovetail your point, they're responsible when we make them responsible. If there's no pressure on companies, companies won't pivot, they won't move, they won't shift. They won't find alternatives to cotton sources. Right now, it's easy and it's cheap, right? So let us unleash the collective power of the consumer to really tell these companies, demand that these companies move their operations and all business ties out of East Turkestan. Less, we're not going to buy their products anymore. And so, Hannah, you said write the companies. Well, I would say write the companies and tell them why you're not buying their products anymore. If they don't know you're not buying your products, yeah, they'll see it on a screen, but they could chalk it up to COVID-19 pandemic and other things. You typically tell the companies, I was going to buy a pair of shoes today at Target, and they were Adidas, and I decided not to buy those sneakers because, you know, I don't want blood on my hands.
Exactly. I've been fasting from China for more than a year now. seriously, it's been tough. I can tell you that. It's tough because a lot of products come out of China. But as a family, we have found Turkish towels and Malaysian wood and
You may be surprised, Hannah. I would highly doubt that cotton, that you haven't picked up a piece of East Turkestani cotton this year. You know, that's how complicated it really is.
Mm.
And
So
I
It
would,
could be made in Turkey, but the cotton could be from East Turkestan.
that is true. That is true. And so how do we tackle that?
if I can add a point as well to this, we're talking about how complex supply chains are and how present cotton from that region is. This doesn't mean that it is impossible for brands to not be sourcing cotton from there and to not be complicit in these abuses. Quite frankly, the problem is complicated, but the answer is very simple.
Right.
And if a brand tells you, oh, it's just really hard to trace cotton, we don't know where it comes from, you have to understand that they are choosing not to know. And brands and retailers have ample resources to map their supply chain and to find out if they are sourcing from the region or not, and to end relationships where that is the case. And just to return to this point about collective action, it is so important. At the end of the day, consumers do hold a lot of power, and they can decide, as you were discussing, Hannah, and as Max said, they can decide which brands to buy from and which brands not to buy from. And as I pointed out, the coalition is going to be making the list of brands who have committed and brands who haven't committed to our call to action public. And consumers are free to choose not to purchase from brands that are remaining and choosing to remain complicit in the horrific abuses that are unfolding in the region.
So essentially, and this is a question I get asked often, people will be like, should we buy or should we not? Is there a central place where these companies are listed? So from the coalition's point of view, the end Uyghur forced labor.org will be the central place where these companies will be listed. Those who have signed on are good to go, and those who haven't and are still a part of that list that is already on there, then this is a resource for consumers that they can go in there and then check, So I'm hoping we can develop this into an app. That would be really cool. Like just, scan it, and if it's on there, if that company's on there, okay, today it's okay, cool to buy or not cool to buy, right? So that would help consumers make that decision. So maybe next meeting should discuss perhaps having something like that available. Yes, go ahead.
I would like to stress what Max brought it up earlier about the bill. That you mentioned, and individuals asking what can we do. If they think writing those companies are so many, we would definitely need support on their support on writing the senators for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It's simple. You can pick up the phone and give them a call, or you can just write to your senators to co-sponsor this bill. So that way the government will put the pressure on those companies as well. And besides the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, there's another new one called the Slave-Free Business Certification Act. That also prevents China to move people from one region to other region, and also hold American company accountable. So basically introduced by Senator Hawley to hold corporate America accountable for having slave labor in their supply chain. So supporting those bills will be also greatly appreciated. If we can get a lot of co-sponsor and this bill gets in act, it will also be a big success as well.
Okay, so we'll look into that. One question I did have, Penelope, the coalition is further committed to working with multilateral organizations like the ILO and OECD to use their mechanisms to end forced labor. So what are their mechanisms, if you could share that with me?
Sure. So the ILO has a convention that bans forced labor. Those are very clear. The OECD guidelines, the ones that pertain the most to this call to action, are the ones that that pertain to due diligence, and where it is impossible to conduct due diligence, as is the case in this specific context, the requirement is that that we need to prevent forced labor, even if it means disengaging from certain factories. And this is really important because if you talk to people in the labor rights sphere, we don't typically tell brands to leave. Our normal approach is brands need to stay and use their leverage to fix the problem. The fact that this is impossible here also speaks to the magnitude of the crisis, and really goes to show that this is not a typical situation where normal instruments can be used. Wow. So this is why we are telling brands to leave, and it's important to note that that is not our typical approach in other countries. Normally, we tell companies that they need to stay and put in the work and put in the money to fix the problem. In this case, even the simple, the remediation for workers who have been subjected to forced labor, typically that is making the workers whole, so making sure they have the wages that they lost and protecting them from forced labor. In this case, even if we were to try to find workers who experience forced labor in the Uyghur region, by virtue of even trying to contact them, we could be putting them in danger. So this is all to say that there are a lot of legal mechanisms, there are a lot of situations in place, but they're not necessarily tailored for the magnitude of this crisis that we're seeing.
Exactly. So we're wrapping up the hour, and it's been really powerful to have you all on. It's a lot of times people understand. So a question just popped up: is there a list of factories or export suppliers using Uyghur labor? I don't think that factories have been identified, except for in the Australian report. Uyghurs for sale. That is one report that has identified a list of factories, so you can look that up. Uyghurs for sale. But these are resources I think need to be built on, so manufacturers, smaller manufacturers who might be a part of the supply chain can also get out. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and we're proud to be a part of this coalition, and we thank all three of you for being here and sharing your views, and just reminding us how much this we need to how much work there it has been done and needs to be done. So thank you so much to our audience for listening in, and we've been saying this, Eid is coming up. Make sure when you're out there shopping for Eid that you do not buy from any of those brands listed on the End Uyghur Forced Labor.org website. Assalamu alaikum.